All right, well, let's go ahead and begin tonight. We have just started the story 2 weeks ago. We began this journey of the story, the Bible as a story, and tried to understand that. And when we started this, I told the story about the story. I told you that in Arizona, a man by the name of Chris Gonzalez had a member of his church ask him to explain the Bible story, and he took out and he wrote on a piece of paper these 6 symbols as a way to simply tell the whole Bible story. And the downward arrow is creation, the X is the fall or the rebellion, the forward arrow is the promise, the cross is of course the redemption, the forward arrow there is the mission, and then the downward arrow is the restoration. And you can kind of see all of that right here, because those are the 6 weeks that we are going through. I also told you the story about a young man named Benjamin, who when he went to the grocery store with his mom, he was leaving and asked her, "Where did all this come from?" And and where did we come from? And she said, "We just came from the grocery store." And he said, "No, where did everything come from?" And he wanted to know where everything came from. And she didn't have the answer to that question. I didn't ever tell you the rest of that story. And the rest of that story is that she started going to church. And this is a true story. Her son went into Sunday school, and they had a lesson on creation. And in that lesson on creation, afterwards, she came up to her mom and she said, "I now know the answer to that question of where did everything come from." Because the way the Bible begins, Bereshit bara Elohim hashamayim v'ha'eretz, in the beginning, it begins the way a story begins. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It begins by answering the question of where did it come from and who are we, by telling us that we were made in the image of God and telling us that God made everything. So then the next question, it's the question we looked at last week, is, well, how did everything get so messed up? And as we look at the world around us, we can't help but feel that things are broken, that they're not the way that they should be. And the Bible has an answer to that. It tells the story of the rebellion. It tells the story of the fall. And as we walk through that story in Genesis 3, I showed you how the fall created a fracture, created damage in 4 different areas of life. It created damage within us, within our relationships with each other, below us, with the world, the earth. It created chaos in the world. And then above us in our relationship with God. And so every one of those areas has been damaged as a result of the fall. One way to say that is that there is fallout from the fall. But then the question is there any hope? Is there any hope of things being put back to right? And already in the book of Genesis, we get a sign of that. In Genesis 3:15, it speaks of the serpent's head being crushed. And we begin to think maybe, just maybe, that there will be an answer to that. But tonight, I want to show you the Bible's big answer to this question about hope with our focus tonight on the theme of the promise. But before I do that, I need to tell you what happened afterwards in Genesis chapter 3. Genesis 3 is the story of the fall, but then as Adam and Eve make their way east out of Eden, things do not look so good. In fact, Genesis 4 is the story of Cain and Abel, the 2 brothers, one of whom kills his brother. And then from then on, things continue to go downhill. In Genesis 5, and then finally in Genesis 6, there is an event in which God says, I've had it with these people. I've had it with this planet. I've given it a try, and I'm giving up. And he destroys the world in a huge event called the flood. But he does rescue one family, Noah and his sons, as you would remember, and their wives. And they come out of the ark on the other side, and God sort of starts over. And it looks like maybe things are going to turn out fine. And then you read what happens in Genesis 7 and Genesis 8 and Genesis 9. As the situation reoccurs, the same problems develop. And by the time you get to Genesis chapter 11, the world has become rehabited, and now people are beginning to build for themselves what is described in Genesis 11 as a means by which they can now reach God. It's called, in Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel. The word Babel actually means the gate of God, and it's because at the top of the tower, they put food in the hopes that the God would come down and eat, and then he would make his descent down. Now, the story of the Tower of Babel becomes important in the Bible because it's also where people are confused and they babble with what they say, but it's also the name of a very important place called Babylon. I was reminded of this because sometimes we read these stories and we think, these are just stories. There's not really much to them. They're just old stories that people tell. But I was reminded this last week. I was teaching a seminar down at Baylor, and one of the students in the seminar was in the war in Iraq. And when she was leading that group to the southern part of Iraq, she had within her group some people that were from Jessica Lynch's group. Jessica Lynch, of course, was captured. And that was in this area in southern Iraq in a place called Nazirah. And if you go there today, or if you were in that group as she was and began to describe to us all of the things that she saw in this area, you can see in the distance what is called a ziggurat. It's an ancient Babylonian tower that was built in order to reach up to the heavens in hopes that a god would come down. This is an artist's reconstruction of what it looked like. These ancient Babylonians worshipped a moon god, and indeed they were hoping for just this sort of thing. So as we begin to read tonight the story of the Bible, particularly about a guy named Abraham, this is what Abraham would have looked and seen out of his window, if you will. This was the kind of world that he was living in, and these are the kind of events that would happen. And it all begins for us tonight with what we're going to call the promise. And where I want to pick up is in Genesis chapter 11. I want to just show you a couple of things there, and then we're going to dive right into the big story tonight. But first I want to show you this verse. This is Genesis 11:10, and what's interesting about this verse is that it starts with a very strange construction, the same construction that we saw in the Garden of Eden when it says, this is the account of Adam and Eve, this is the account of Shem's family. That's Noah's son. And we begin to get a description, if you go and read that, of all that happened with all of that family. But then if you fast forward a few verses to Genesis 11:27, it repeats that. This is the account of Terah's family. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran became the father of Lot. Now we read these things if you've ever read the Old Testament and you just kind of gloss over it and go, well, this isn't, this is the boring, let's get to the good stuff. But this really is the good stuff. This is telling us the story of how all of this begins to take place. The God who was there when things were put right and had made them right and was there when things went wrong continues to have a hope and continues to have a plan to make them right. And we begin to see this in this particular story. And I want us to pick up there and just keep on reading in Genesis 11:27. You remind me if I don't press the forward button here in just a second. This is the account of Terah's family. Terah became the father of Abram, and we know him also by the name Abraham, Nahor, and Haran became the father of Lot. While his father Terah was still alive, Haran died in Ur of the Chaldeans. Now the ziggurat I just showed you is from Ur Nazirah. It's from this place in the world. That's where Abram's brother died, in the land of his birth. Abram and Nahor both married. The name of Abraham's wife was Sarai. Those of you who may know your Bible know that it gets changed to Sarah. And the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran, the father of both Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was childless, and we begin to see tension beginning in the story, a problem. Sarai was childless because she was not able to conceive. Okay, thanks for reminding me. Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Abram, and together they set out from Ur of the Chaldeans. So they're leaving this land, this picture that I just showed you, to go, it says, to Canaan. But when they came to Haran, which is interestingly the same name as one of the sons, but it's a different, because it's actually a place, they settled there. Terah lived 205 years, and he died in Haran. Now, this is a Google map of this part of the world, and just kind of get your bearings, you can see Haran and those rivers that come down out of it. Those are the Tigris and the Euphrates. The land between those rivers is called Mesopotamia. Meso means in the midst of, Potamia means the rivers. In the midst of the two rivers is the cradle of civilization. This is where the world came into being. As you move down the Tigris and Euphrates, you get close to Ur of the Chaldeans, but they made this journey up along these rivers until they got to Haran, which is just on the other side of the border of Iraq in a country today called Turkey. And then they would eventually make their way down in a path that's known famously as the Fertile Crescent. It's the path you would have traveled in the ancient world. Well, this begins to be the story. And it's really a strange story in so many ways. It's not the kind of story we would have ever expected to actually happen. We read Genesis 1 and 2, we see the problem. We would never expect the solution would look anything like this. But it starts, the solution does, with this person we know as Abraham. That's eventually what his name becomes, not just Abram, but Abraham. We also call him Father Abraham. And this is the beginning of his story. It starts in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 1. The Lord said to Abram, "Go," and that's a very important word, "from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you." And so begins this incredible story. It's about an Iraqi man. That's what the story of Abraham is, from Ur, who's married to a barren woman, who are living in the advanced years of their life, whom God has called to go on an incredible journey to a place they have never been before. And that's how the great story begins, with the person of Abraham. The person of Abraham, though, is not really the focus of what we're talking about here, although you can see his journey from Ur to Babylon, up along the Euphrates River, all the way up to Haran, and then down through what is today's Syrian Aleppo and Damascus, into the land of Israel, Shechem, which is into the north of Israel, down to Beersheba, which is in the southern part of Israel. And Abram eventually will make journeys in and out of Egypt. He really traveled the whole world. Although this is a big part of the story we would love to spend some time on and even tell you more about this incredible family and what God was doing there, I want us to focus on one particular component of this story. I want us to focus on the promise that God makes to Abraham himself. And the promise is found in Genesis chapters 12, 1, 2, and 3. It says, "The Lord had said to Abram, 'Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I'll show you.'" I just read that, but you'll notice there's a land that he's going to. We call this later on the promised land, because this is where that came from. If you've ever wondered, where does promised land come from? This is the verse. It's Genesis 12:1. "I will make you into a great nation." Now, if you just stop and think about this is an incredibly strange thing to say to a man who's advanced in his years, is coming from a foreign country. He's married to someone who's beyond the ability to have children. How in the world is he going to have so many children that he could even have a nation, but even more than that, it could be a great nation? "I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great." If you fast forward 4,000 years today, and you look at the three great religions of the world, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, these three religions represent the majority of the world's population. And for 4,000 years, there is no other name that has been better known by the people who lived on this planet. This is a singular promise that has been fulfilled, and we can attest to in our own world today. But then he says something else. "You will be a blessing." Now that's a very interesting thing to say to someone. Not only am I going to bless you, not only am I going to give you a nation, not only am I going to give you a name, but I'm going to bless you. "And I will bless those who bless you. And whoever curses you, I'll curse." And then he says this, "All peoples on earth will be blessed through you." All peoples on earth will be blessed through you. And this single phrase, "all peoples on earth will be blessed through you," stands out as one of the greatest statements in the entire Bible. In fact, if you were to go to the New Testament and go with Jesus on a place where he gives the Great Commission, and he says, go, just like Abraham was told to go, make disciples of all nations, the original Great Commission comes to Abraham. When the world had fallen, when it was in rebellion, when everything was coming apart, God, in all of history and all of time and all of place, came to one singular, unlikely man and said, you go, and through you, I will bless the entire world. It's an incredible statement. It's an incredible promise, but it's also specific. This blessing is going to happen through his offspring at a moment when he doesn't have any, and it doesn't seem that this would even be possible. And this begins to become one of the themes that works its way through the entire Old Testament. God makes a promise, and everyone wonders, couldn't it ever be fulfilled? It seems as if there's no chance that it can be fulfilled, and then God somehow comes through to the rescue, and he shows his faithfulness. Later, God also promises Abraham in this way. He took him outside, and he said, look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said, so shall your offspring be. And again, he still didn't have any offspring. This is an artist's description or effort to show this scene from the text. So the promise to Abraham is that he is going to bless and be a blessing to the entire world, that what was going wrong in the fall and in the rebellion would begin to be put right through this promise and through his descendants. And from this moment on, we begin to have a story, and it becomes this unfolding story, about 39 books long, that we call the Old Testament. The Old Testament is the unfolding of this promise, and we see it in character after character after character. I won't go through them all. I won't tell you all the stories, but maybe I'll just give you the highlight real quickly. Here is Abraham. It starts with him, of course. And the good news is, if you don't know this, he does finally have a child. It's an incredible moment in the text because he's told once again he's going to have one. His wife Sarah is told she's going to have one. And they both laugh. In Hebrew, they give their child this name, Isaac, and it means he laughs. But somewhere in the background, we see that God is really the one who is really chuckling. He knows that his promise is being fulfilled, even when they didn't think it could be possible. And then throughout the stories of the book of Genesis, there's questions as to whether or not God can do this and whether he can come through. And Abraham is tested and so on with his son Isaac. But eventually, Isaac has two sons, Jacob and Esau. They're twins. And even though Esau is supposed to receive the blessing, it ends up being his brother Jacob who steals birthright and blessing and runs to his family, his other family, to get help. And as he's on his journey, he stops one night and he has a dream. In the dream, he wrestles with an angel, and God blesses him and gives him a new name, and he becomes known as Israel. Abraham begat Isaac. Isaac begat Jacob. Another way to say that is that Isaac begat Israel. That through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob comes the story of Israel. In fact, Jacob famously has 12 sons, the youngest of which is Joseph, born to his wife Rachel, the only one who's born to his wife Rachel, and he dotes on Joseph. Not only does he dote on Joseph, he gives him this kind of special coat, and his brothers are jealous. He's sold into slavery by them and goes to live in Egypt. He becomes a slave in Egypt again, living in a prison. And he becomes an interpreter of dreams, and that becomes well known of him, so that Pharaoh calls upon Joseph to come and interpret his dream. When he can do so, Joseph is blessed by Pharaoh, and he's put in charge of all of Egypt, this great land. And during that time, Egypt is blessed. But if you know some of the story, you also know something interesting happens. You begin to wonder, how is God's promise going to be fulfilled? And what's going to happen with this promise? His brothers will eventually come down into Egypt in need of help because of a famine. And they'll have to go to Joseph for help. And Joseph will rescue them, and he'll rescue his father. And something amazing happens in this story, because the sons of Jacob, or the sons of Israel, will then come to live in Egypt. And it's there along the Nile, in this fertile land, that these sons of Abram, Isaac, and Jacob will finally live in a place where they can grow and multiply until they can become a great nation. This is how it happens, in the most unlikely place and through the most unlikely means. And then in Egypt and out of Egypt, God will send a deliverer, a man named Moses, whose job is to take them out of Egypt in what is called in the Bible Exodus. The name Exodus means the road out of, the way out of Egypt, through the Red Sea, to a mountain called Sinai. And there God renews his promise. Or put in another language of the Bible, he renews his covenant. Another way to say it is he refuels his covenant. The covenant from time to time, the promise from time to time needs to be refueled. And from moment to moment, God will come back and say, I'm still here. I'm still faithful. I'm still keeping my promise to you. And as they look around, this incredible nation is marching out of Egypt. This is the world from Egypt as they travel up toward this new land. But as they make their way toward, and in this journey, Moses, of course, never leads them into this promised land. They wander for 40 years in the wilderness. And it will take Joshua, who's been with them the whole time, to lead them across the Jordan and take possession of the promised land finally. But what's interesting is in the Bible, the stories are told not of the great conquest of the Israelites, but of the great faithfulness of God. When they come to the walled fortress of Jericho, they march around it and its walls just come tumbling down because of the faithfulness of God. God has somehow miraculously provided for them all through this journey, and God continues to keep his great promise that he has made to and through Abraham to bless the entire world. And then during a long period, the Israelites live in this land. There's 12 of them. You'll remember the tribes, so they divided into 12 regions. They appoint local rulers, chieftains they call judges, and things don't go so well for them. And they decide what they really want is a king. And so they call for a man named Saul, who fails. And so they send for a man named David, who succeeds. And after David, a son Solomon will rule. And after Solomon, an interesting thing happens. This incredible reign results in a division of the empire. 10 tribes of the north form what is the northern part of the kingdom called Israel or Samaria, and Judah to the south forms its own nation around the city called Jerusalem. And so you have a divided kingdom. You can see here on the map just some of the different ways in which that kingdom has been divvied up. But this begins to become a problem for them. And God will send during this period of the Bible, this period of the story, in this part of the Bible, people called prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then a whole host of other prophets who basically have one message. God made a promise to you. God made a covenant with you. Make sure you keep it, or else. Or else. And prophet after prophet makes that statement. And finally, they don't listen to that. And the result in the Bible, in the biblical story, is the consequence, the or else. They are sent into exile. First, the northern kingdom is destroyed in 722 BC by the Assyrian Empire. And then in 586 BC, the Neo-Babylonian, so that land where Abraham grew up in, now has a new kingdom and has a new king, and his name is Nebuchadnezzar. And he marches across the world and he lays siege to Jerusalem, destroys it, and takes its people captive back into the land of Babylon. And nothing is ever the same again. Only a few will ever make their way back. Only a few will come back to a city of Jerusalem that will be in ruins, no temple. They'll have to rebuild it under Ezra and Nehemiah. They'll have to rebuild a temple and its walls. But nothing will look the way that it once did. And there's this overwhelming sense that the God who made his promise to Abraham is silent once again. In fact, from the book of Malachi to Matthew, the last book of the Old Testament to the first book of the New Testament, there are 400 silent years in which it seems as if the promise of God has been forgotten. And we begin to wonder, is there any hope for this vast world that they are a part of? Is there any hope for them? We go back to that question that we were asking in the garden after the fall. Is there any hope for the world? Is there anything that God could do or would do? But then we remember in Genesis 12 that his promise was to bless all the nations through his offspring. So what if one could come through whom all of this might be achieved? And I want to cheat just a little bit and give you an advanced warning as to what might be coming. There's a writer in the New Testament we call Paul, and he wrote a little book called Galatians. And in this little book called Galatians, he said something really interesting. He said Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. He quotes from the verses we just read. Understand then that those who have faith are children of Abraham. Scripture foresaw that God would justify the Gentiles by faith. And look what I put in bold. And announce the gospel in advance to Abraham. And this is what he said. All nations will be blessed through you. When in Genesis 12, this man from Ur of the Chaldeans, this wanderer from a faraway place, heard that message, all nations will be blessed through you. Paul says he was hearing the gospel in advance. This is the gospel in the book of Genesis chapter 12, written so many years before. And to find out the answer to that gospel, to the person of that gospel, and to the rest of this story, you're going to have to wait until the next time. I'll see you guys next week. We will finish this part of the story, and we're going to get to the cross. So I'll see you next week.